In the last couple of videos then, we've seen a couple of slightly different walks, but very similar in many respects. And of course we've seen the different workflows for how you can approach, sticking a walk cycle together. Even though the two walks were different and the approaches were different, what we generally saw was that the basic body mechanics going on are really what represents what can be called the normal walk cycle, or the most general walk cycle. Now, whilst this is all well and good, it doesn't always apply. A great deal of the time, what a walk needs to do is going to come down not just to the mood of the character, but to the character themselves. And so even though we've seen this normal mechanic, you must understand that there are actually a huge variety of mechanics that can be applied to different walk cycles. So here we've got a little guy, and he's doing a walk cycle as well, and he's doing this funny little strut. It's very nice, it's very smooth, it's very cartoony. And for the most part, to look at it, it seems that other than, a couple of changes in pose, we have broadly the same mechanic going on. And we do in certain areas. If we look at the actions of the toes and the feet and how they lift and peel and, step to step to step, we've got an awful lot of the same stuff going on. If we look at the swing of the hip, we see that even though it's more exaggerated than that we've done so far, it's still broadly the same. He clicks up on the side of the foot that's carrying the weight and tips down on the side of the foot that's lifted up, and so on, and he swings or pushes side to side on his X channel, and so on. However, there are things that are quite different. Notice, of course, what his head is doing. Normally, or when we saw it before, we were keeping the head at sort of a level. It was counteracting the bend in the spine and the hip. Notice here that the head is going completely along with this curve of the spine. So we're getting this arc and this curve in his shape. And so as, of course, he goes from side to side, we get this bobbing action taking place on the head here. Also notice what the root item is doing. Of course, what we saw before was that when he's at the extreme, when the legs are spaced far apart, the root is slightly down. It does a little dip as he catches his weight. But during the passing position, as his, contacting leg straightens out, his root or his hip goes up. But notice here we've got the exact opposite taking place. As we hit the passing position, the hip is low. As we hit the extreme, the hip is high. It is completely the opposite mechanic to what we have seen so far, but look at the difference that it makes to the walk. It gives him this little strut motion. Also, of course, notice where we carry the body in relation to the legs. The body is set further back. Previously, of course, we were talking about creating this sense of, momentum and whatnot, and we're carrying the root forwards of the legs like that. So of course he's constantly pushing himself forwards, but here he's not. He's dragging himself along from behind. It's completely the opposite. And yet, in spite of these differences, these complete opposite differences in these respects, it works. And we get a totally different sense of the character from it. Notice also, of course, what the arms are doing. They're doing this little shake side to side. They're not actually swinging backwards. The basic mechanic is still the same. The left arm swings back as the left leg comes forward, and vice versa for the right. The arms and legs swing in opposition. But notice that he's keeping his elbows tight. They're not really coming out. What we can also see, if we actually take a look at the keyframes for the upper arm and the elbow, is we see that they are in sync with one another. We've got no overlap here. Why? Because he's holding his arms tight together in this little strut. There doesn't need to be an overlap because we've got less of the pendulum-like motion. There's less of a passive swing taking over. He's really using the muscles of his arms to hold them upright. And of course that gives him this little shake to shake to shake from side to side. It would, in fact, you can just imagine putting a little wiggle on the hands at each extreme as it goes from side to side and giving him a pair of maracas. You've almost got that little sort of dance move going on in his walk here. You can also notice stuff like the knees, which, as it happens, I haven't needed to correct animation for on the poles, but notice that when they lift and come up, his knees poke out to the side. We're not keeping them in line. at least not in the same sort of way. And this again gives that little added pop when he lifts his leg from this view here. Gives this little sense of a dance type action. Of course, it would be great to, go through all of the different walks that you can have, having this sort of style, or having a sad walk, or having a stealthy walk. There are a great number of such examples that we could work on and illustrate. But to that end, there's almost an infinite number. As such, when it comes to creating a walk cycle, a lot of what you'll have to do is experimentation, but largely what you need to focus on is the key pose, the overall shape of the body. And as you can see here, we've got this leant back root, these pressed forward legs, this curved back spine. We have this side-to-side curvature that keeps flipping and reversing on each step that goes right through the body and into the head. So the design of the walk cycle really comes from this. It's the character shape throughout the motion that starts to give the sense of who they are, what they're doing, and so on. Once you get into the body mechanics, it is then about finding an appropriate movement that works for the kind of character and walk that you are working on. However, that said, do notice that there will always be things that are more or less constant, like the action and contact of the feet here. The fact that one really needs to flap down before the other one can lift off too much, little things like that. The shifting of the weight onto the appropriate leg. If that's not present, it will look quite unnatural. We might have been able to reverse the up and down motion of the root item here, but if we'd reversed the side-to-side motion of it, it would look quite wrong. Another thing that we haven't really seen for bipeds yet, and which we won't really spend the time to go through and painstakingly key out, is the run cycle. Of course, what you will find is that the majority of the mechanic of the run cycle is exactly the same to the walk cycle. It's just that the poses are pushing a bit more extreme. So you can see here that he's really leaning his body forwards into his run, keeping himself balanced. His extreme pose, his legs are spread much more broadly here. And of course his sense of up, down, as we go through the cycle, how much his root item or his hip bounces up and down, is also exaggerated, of course, which lends itself to the greater sense of weight and momentum that he's having to catch on this falling leg, as well as, of course, accentuating the amount of press or push that he's having to make off his rear leg. What you'll also notice, of course, is that you don't have the same overlap between contact and leaving. There is a couple of frames in the middle here where he is in flight, where both legs come off the ground completely. You can also notice in this character that I've reversed the action of the spine slightly, so you'll see that as he comes down and takes his weight, his spine is pitching upwards as he's trying to maintain his balance, but then as he thrusts himself forwards like this off of the trailing leg, he pushes his spine forwards as again a way to keep his body momentum and his weight travelling forwards. What you can also notice in this example, and just so as you know, this is all linear keys at present, I haven't done any kind of spline work on here, is that the arms have a much more rigid tick-tock to them. So you'll notice that the arms come up, hold their pose for a couple of frames, then swing back the other way, hold that pose, swing, hold, and so on. And again, in this example, because he's really sort of locking those arms in and powering them along, there's no overlapping action between the keyframes on the elbow and the keyframes on the shoulder. Although, of course, that's not to say that there wouldn't be in every single run. Just like walks, runs will be slightly different from point to point and character to character. The other thing that is an important characteristic of any run cycle is the stability that you get from the added speed. It's kind of like being on a bicycle. If you just, try and push a bicycle along very slowly, then it's highly unstable and you tend to tip, to the side one way or the other. However, once you actually get up speed and momentum on a bicycle, it balances very well on two wheels. It's not prone to tipping over sideways. And the same is true for any kind of body travelling at speed, whether it's a person or a bicycle or a freight train. Speed and forward momentum creates stability. As such, what you can notice is that while we've still got the side-to-side action taking place on the hip, it is much reduced. We're by no means going as far side-to-side as we would do in a walk cycle. The body is much more balanced whilst it is moving. As such, as you start to accentuate the side-to-side motion, let me just do it here by way of example. I'll just grab the X keys of that root item here and scale them really quite a lot to really, push it out and accentuate what's going on here. We'll take it to that point where at the extreme his root, his hip is pretty much right over his ankle. Then what we see is it starts to look far less natural. It is in fact looking quite unbalanced. He's pushing too much in his side to side. Of course, if you're a more cartoony character, you might be getting away with this. You might have him sort of leaping side to side rather than just, forwards in each run. If you were doing a more exaggerated, overly cartoonish walk cycle or run cycle, But generally not. You keep this greater level of stability in the body so the spine isn't flipping around as much. The hips aren't slinking side to side as much. Also, of course, you wind up with what looks overall to be in slightly smoother motion. But of course, you must remember that character variety plays into it an awful lot as well, and the design of a character's body or anatomy will make a big difference on how they need to move. Take this little fella, this little potato guy. I mean, look at his legs. He doesn't even have knees. His legs just sort of pop in and out of his body like this. Yet, there are certain things that we take from the general walk cycle mechanics. Notice that as his trailing foot comes up off the ground, it comes up fast. Then as it pushes forward to come into the contact position, it travels slow. But of course, we get this little overhang where the foot comes forward completely before it makes its contact. And what we wind up with is a little cycle that looks like this. Very basic, very cartoony. We can see that generally the foot and leg action is broadly following the mechanic that we've been exploring, although it's far less detailed. And you'll see that we've also put a little side to side and a dodge on each side as he comes along as well. Notice how, of course, he doesn't just pitch forward, he banks right over onto the side, which is opposing his contacting foot, so his whole weight is shifting side to side like this, which in turn gives him this very funny, cartoony little bounce action. And we can really ask ourselves, what kind of motion is this for such a simple character? I mean, is this a run? Is it a walk? I suppose that I think it's a run. It's got that sort of movement to it, but because he's got such tiny, stumpy little legs, he's not covering an awful lot of ground. And of course, with such tiny legs, he doesn't have a huge amount of clearance space to get his foot past. If you look at the length of his foot compared to the length of his leg, it's pretty large. He's got big clodhopper feet. As such, maybe he needs to get a little bit of air in his walk cycle. So as you can see, there are many issues surrounding walks and runs. The basic mechanics that we've laid out in the different walk cycle videos so far really will serve you in good stead and a good place to start practicing walks. Once you can get those smooth and get all of your keys, lined up properly so that everything behaves itself, then you're in a good position to start moving on to more characterful walks. But do be aware that the exact mechanics will vary, and there's nothing like just trying a bit of experimentation on different characters with different body shapes using different cycle times and patterns inside the mechanics. I also want to visit back just a little bit more on the technique we discussed with the Hulk walk cycle. With that video, of course, we're going through the steps of putting it all together from the view of, how you piece the keyframes in, make sure you've got the right motions going on and so forth. Whilst part of the aim, of course, was to talk about a different technique and approach for putting together something like a walk cycle, it was still very much about the basic mechanics of getting a cycle together. So the reason I want to revisit is just to focus some detail on the technique itself and where it can really be useful beyond just your standard sort of, walk cycling. So we imagine that we've got this, set up here. Here's a character, perhaps he's working at a bar, for instance, and having just served a drink, he needs to take the money back to the back counter and put it in the till. Now this is interesting, of course, because he's got a set distance that he has to cover. And so, of course, you've got to get the number of steps correct for that. But you can't just say, okay, well, I had him taking 4 steps, because you might wind up having to take very tiny steps over such a short distance, which is stupid. So in a situation like this, you don't want to think about how many steps it takes to get there. You just want to think about the amount of time. What we're looking at here is the spacing and the timing of the entire character. We're ignoring the mechanics of the walk that need to take place. So if we see this just roughly, then of course, he takes the money and off he goes to the back counter, and there he arrives at the back counter and at the till, and we see him just sort of glide across like that. Very nice and simple. He is, of course, going across the correct amount of space, and he's doing it within a certain period of time. This is the pace at which we want the move and the transition to occur. Of course, what we have done, though, is to use the technique that we came upon in the Hulk. We have just bothered to animate the upper body, or at least the root portion. We have set in our timing and spacing before anything else. We don't care at this stage of the animation about the mechanics of what the feet have to do to get him there. In other words, we're looking at the time and space of the whole character first, and we're working backwards from that into the mechanics that are necessary to support the move. Notice as well here that this is one of those occasions where we're working cross-axis. He needs to walk across this little diagonal line to get where he's going. And this can also be one of those situations where this technique and this approach is helpful. If you're either unwilling or unable to, orient the rig in such a way so as that you are animating on axis and you have to animate cross axis, then working in this way can be exceedingly helpful. Because, of course, it just allows you to lay out the basic path in a nice straight line without having to worry about the little side-to-side movements and all the other subtlety that happen in between him getting from the front bar to the rear counter. What you can do instead is just work on his entire body moving like this. Then, once that's in, you can come back and start stitching in the detailed in-betweens that are needed to support the overall mechanic. As such, once we've got the basic timing and spacing for how the character needs to cross this distance worked in, we can then come in and, as we've done here, just start laying in very basic keys for the footfalls, figure out where they need to be. Of course, we can look at the length of stride that's necessary, and as one foot begins to extend too far behind him, we just bring the next foot forward, so he takes as many steps as he needs to take to cross the space. And notice, of course, that at this point we haven't worked any detail on the root item of the up-down bounce. We've got the timing and spacing for the root, and now we're able to work on the timing and spacing of the feet. And they, of course, just take as much time and as much space as they need to in order to accommodate what his upper body is doing. Beyond that, of course, you can then start working through more, and you see now that we start to put in some of the up-down action here on the hip. And of course, once we've worked in those basics, we can then go and start working in the next stage, putting in some of the up-down action that needs to occur on the hip. Some of the little foot roll and tuck and so forth like that. Obviously, ignore this for the minute, it's just very much roughed in here. But you can see the basic approach by which we are building up the animation, getting enough step whilst maintaining the timing and space to get our character to properly and correctly cross the distance that he needs to and go from point A to point B. And of course, just because I've got this happening here in a simple situation where he's only having to walk 3 or 4 feet, that doesn't mean it can't extend to other situations. If you're needing a character to run the length of a football field, you would want it to happen over a certain period of time. And so once again, you don't have to start from the point of the walking mechanic. You can start from the point of the timing and spacing, and then of course stitch the walk mechanic into that afterwards as it needs to occur.